Yeah, buddy. I think I'm going to cover. This is my old block. Guachis live there. People that used to live in the neighborhood, you see the old neighborhood. This is 91st Street. If you look down that way, steep hill I grew up on, you have Giants Stadium down that way. I might do a little bit longer video today because I was going to do George Washington Bridge or New York City. I'm going to do it, but I won't today. So maybe I'll do a little more teaching. I called my friend Rick. Rick's a good friend that I met up here over the last 6 years coming back. Rick is the one friend from North Bergen that calls. Every so often it calls me in Texas. And I don't listen to my messages, but whenever I do, like I had a missed call from New Jersey a few weeks ago, and then it was Rick. So I listened to the message that day. And the messages are always, Johnny, why don't you ever answer your phone? Look, I got friends that get mad, and so I'm glad that I called Rick. I told him I'm in town. Just now I talked to him. I'm going to see him later, hopefully. This is how I used to walk to school. I'll probably walk it right now. So I told him, yes, I'm in town. I kid around with him. He says, I got to do some work right now, but at 4 o'clock I'll be free and we'll run into each other up at Burger King. I said, well, don't you have to film today? He said, what? I said, you got to film for the Ricky Ricardo show. He laughs. He says, no, they're not paying me enough. I'm going to cancel the series. Rick's last name is not Ricardo, but it's kind of a joke because, sometimes as a joke, they refer to Rick as Ricky Ricardo. And one time cops came in, they had a complaint. Somebody complained about Rick. I remember that, like somebody said something to him and, Rick was like, don't be disrespecting me that way, which is true. So the other guy, I guess, was upset. So they called the cops. So Rick told me it was funny because he said when the cops came looking for him, I think at White Castle, about that complaint, which was nothing illegal. They were looking for Ricky Ricardo. The other person, I guess, thought that was actually Rick's name. So it became a joke, So I kid him. All right, let's do a little of 2 Samuel 19. I figured I'll teach somewhat a little bit longer today. In the story of David at this stage of the journey, I could do a whole hour on politics today and news and the media, and I might comment somewhat. But David, I mentioned this on the plane, I think, on the plane video. King David at this stage of the journey takes back the capital city of Jerusalem, which was the capital of Israel, which David established as Israel's second king. And his son Absalom, these last 4 chapters or so, 2 Samuel 15 through 19, David's son Absalom mounted a rebellion against King David. So they had a little bit of a minor battle. David took back the city, and his son Absalom was killed in the battle. Now David gave specific instructions to his men, particularly Joab. Joab is a key leader in David's kingdom. But Joab also had a mind of his own, and I've covered how he was very frank with King David, sometimes to the point of rudeness, but Joab also had given David good advice throughout the history of him working with the king. Well, in chapter 19, Absalom has been killed the son of David, who mounted the rebellion. And he was killed because of Joab. Joab actually killed Absalom. And all the men in that fight, that battle, knew not to kill Absalom because the king gave specific directions. Don't kill my son. He's wrong, he's rebelling, but I don't want him dead. Joab said no, and he did it on his own. Now, we don't read that David got word that Joab was the one, but I'm sure David knew. You asked what happened, well, I told you not to kill my son, and they probably said, look, Joab said no. We're taking him out, he's a threat to the kingdom. He already mounted a rebellion. So, that's what happened. Chapter 19, Joab rebukes David again, because David is in mourning that his son is dead. And Joab comes to King David, and he says, what are you doing? Do you love your enemies more than your friends? Today, I think you would be happier if we lost, and if all of us, your men, were killed, and if Absalom survived, because you're acting in such mourning. That's down the hill there. You're in such mourning over the death of your son Absalom, and today should be a day of celebration and victory. And Joab confronts David. David's in mourning. And he says, if you don't get up now and sit and show yourself as the victor, show yourself as this king, I swear to you by the Lord, Joab says, that more evil will come upon you if you don't do what I'm telling you to do than all the evil you've ever experienced in your whole life since the day you were born until this day. That's a pretty harsh word from one of your advisors, okay? One of your military advisors. Well, David, once again, takes the advice of Joab, which has been fairly good advice throughout the history of David. And he does it. He says, okay, let's celebrate the victory. He still has to be consolidated in Jerusalem because the battle that they won against Absalom was David and his men fighting against Israel. Because Israel was so quick. This is like a chapter of reckoning. The people of God, Israel, who David was the legitimate king over, they were so quick to dump him and to go with the rebellion. It's a sign of many things in society. But Absalom endeared himself to the people. He sat at the gate and he took care of the issues of the people. This is before he mounted the rebellion. And the people liked him. And Absalom was a good-looking boy, and so they just went with something new. But they did it by rebelling. And so that's kind of what happened with them at that particular point. And now that Absalom is dead, all of the people begin asking, wait a minute, King David was the one who fought for us. He was the one who delivered us from all of the enemies. He was the commander under Saul. He was a great king. And they're starting to rethink what they did. And yet we were so quick to dismiss David. So now there's question. In this chapter you also find there was a man back in chapter 16 of 2 Samuel, Shemaiah. Shemaiah was the man who was cursing David when David was on the run after Absalom mounted the rebellion. And Shemaiah was the guy that was going along throwing rocks, saying, you bloody man, David, you're reaping what you sowed. Well, now, Shemaiah is one of the first people from the house of Joseph, the tribes, to greet David, to come back. And when Shemaiah realizes he sinned against David by cursing at him and by kicking him when he was down. Now Shemaiah is worried because David's back. So he comes right away and he says, I'm sorry. He says, I sinned against you, David. You know, I hope you can forgive me. David forgives him. It's an interesting thing here. You got to read into the text. When Shemaiah, in chapter 16 of 2 Samuel, when Shemaiah was cursing David, one of David's men, one of the sons of Zeruiah, I think his name was Abishai, one of David's men, at that point earlier, wanted to take his head off. David had warriors with him, and that's how they did it back then. And David said, no, don't kill him. That's when they were on the run. Now in this chapter, that son of Zeruiah, he's been after this Shemaiah, wanting to get him since a few chapters ago. And now he says to King David, this man has approached David, said, forgive me, I'm the one that cursed you, I messed up, I'm sorry, can you forgive me? And he's learned through the story he's been through, his own history, he's learned that the kings reign, but they do it with mercy and justice both. And David errs a lot on the side of mercy. And his man, Abishai, knows David's like that. So instead, there's one little verse in 2 Samuel 16. And he appeals to the nobility of David. But it doesn't show you that in the verse. But if you read the verse and the history of David, you can see Abishai still wants to kill this guy, Shemaiah. He still wants to kill that enemy because he says to David, should Shemaiah live? After all, David, he came against the Lord's anointed. Meaning he came against God's man, which happens to be you, David. And that, I think that's a subtle way for Abishai to finally, if you will, to finally get the chop his head off. Because David's history, even before he became king, when he was fighting against Saul, David's history was touch not the Lord's anointed. Scriptures about that. So I think in that little subtle way, Abishai said, let's kill Shemaiah right now, because he touched the Lord's anointed. And David has mercy on the man that cursed him. Now another thing happens in this chapter. The story of Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, which I covered somewhat the last few weeks. That's the lame or crippled son of Jonathan that survived when Saul and his household were killed. Well, this son, David took care of. My dad used to work at this firehouse. And every day, now you're seeing my normal walk to school when I was a kid. Every day I did this walk down Kennedy Boulevard. And I did it when I went to grade school, which is right down the block. It's called Horace Mann. And also North Bergen High School. I might do them both right now. Okay. Mephibosheth. He was the injured, crippled son of Jonathan, the grandson of King Saul. Okay, that's Horace Mann School. Mephibosheth comes to King David now, chapter 19. David's back. He's going to be restored as king. And David asks him, and he says, Mephibosheth, why didn't you go with me when I was run out of Jerusalem by my son, Absalom? Why didn't you stay with me? And Mephibosheth says, I wanted to go. But Ziba, the man who you put in charge of the whole household at the time, I taught this before, he slandered me before you, David, and Ziba lied. And because I'm lame, crippled, I wanted to saddle up on the mules and go, but he left me behind. Now this was the case, that's Horace Mann School, this was the case when David was on the run. The man Ziba was put in charge of the entire remaining household of Saul, and Ziba became like a servant to this crippled grandson of Saul, son of Jonathan, whose name is Mephibosheth. And Ziba didn't like that. Ziba didn't like it that David honored the oath he had with Jonathan earlier on in the history. So Ziba approached David, I covered this, and said, I'm with you, and Mephibosheth, he's staying behind. He thinks he's going to finally inherit, that's horsemanship. He thinks he's going to finally inherit the kingdom of Saul. But more than likely, Ziba was lying. But we don't know for sure. And Mephibosheth gives the other side of the story, which I just gave you. Now, I don't know if David, most times when we read that, we think, yeah, Ziba did lie. But one thing you got to keep note of, Ziba did take a risk when he did leave Mephibosheth behind and follow David, because the odds were that David maybe would not make it back. So David quickly is hearing two sides of the story in the midst of still people with ulterior motives all around him. So David, he actually doesn't know. From the statement he makes, he says, okay, I've heard enough about this matter. Whether Mephibosheth's telling the truth, whether Ziba, he says, instead just split all of the goods from the household of Saul that were left over. Because David initially gave all the inheritance to Mephibosheth. Ziba was just a servant. Then, when Ziba followed David in this rebellion, David said, I give it all to you, Ziba. So now he tries to rule justly, tries to make a just decision. And he says, I'm going to let you split it, because I don't really know who's telling the truth. And Mephibosheth says, let Ziba have it all. I don't care. Just the fact that you're restored, David, back to the kingdom, that's enough for me. What was I anyway that you honored me in such a way that you did, and you let me eat at your table? So he settles that dispute. Now, David still has to make it back to the city of Jerusalem. This is all in process. He's going to be restored. And then there's talk in all of the nation of Israel about, geez, look, we were kind of bad. Let's let David come back. But then David appeals. There, in the nation of Israel, you have 12 tribes, those of you that are Bible students. And David's tribe is the tribe of Judah. Okay? So David makes a decision as he starts getting restored in the midst of all this that's going on. And he tells the elders or leaders of Judah, you're my own flesh and blood. Why don't you just return me first? You should be the first. It was the leaders of Judah, the elders of Judah, that's Our Lady of Fatima Church. They were the ones that were kind of like the last to want to, when you do wrong to your own brothers. This is much of like a type of Christ in the New Testament. It was the leadership of the Jewish community, which we refer to as the Pharisees and Sadducees elders. They were the ones that were last to come in. And Jesus says that in his teachings. He says all the harlots and all the criminals, they enter the kingdom before you. He says, but they're repenting. They're believing in my authority. This is Jesus, who is referred to as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He says, but you leaders, the ones that should have known, you're teachers of the law. You're the last ones because of the pride and arrogance of your hearts. So David, Our Lady of Fatima Church, which I'll go to Sunday, David tells the leaders of Judah, bring me back. And they decide, yes, we're going to bring you back. It's kind of interesting. If I remember, I'll close the chapter with why that's interesting. So Judah, the leadership says, come on back, David. David comes back. One little other verse in this chapter that sometimes we don't think, what's that? Sometimes we don't think, a whole lot about. But there's one verse in the midst of all of this where David says, in the context of what I'm talking about, David says, and not only should you all bring me back, Judah, my tribe, but I'll even replace Joab with one of the new other commanders. He says, I'm going to replace General Flynn, Joab. So he finally, David replaces him. I think the man is Amasa, Amasa. So David replaces Joab. So he's taking care of business. He's got stuff going on. And he also replaces one of his key advisors in the midst of a lot of stuff. At the end of the chapter, Israel, the 10 tribes, they're disgruntled with their brothers Judah. And then they start arguing and saying, well, why were you, Judah, the ones that were first to bring the king back? We have 10 lots, 10 tribes of us. We have more inheritance. We're more with David than you are. And it's so interesting how fickle the electorate could be. They just basically wanted to get rid of him. And once they got rid of David, then now they're fighting at the end of the chapter who is really more for David, more with David, more aligned with David. And in leadership, that's a dynamic that you deal with in life. Initially, you'll have people that supposedly are for you, they're against you. And if I commented at all on I think that's the most of chapter 19. Those are the points I wanted to hit. I might have forgot one or two things. Right now, I'm a big news watcher, news person. I'm not a big Trump supporter. I was not a big Obama supporter. I think we overemphasize the actual importance of presidents, because in this country there's so much sway. The last 2 or 3 days, CNN's been on a lot, and I'll watch them all. They've taken, I sat down, my mom's a big news person, very liberal, Democrat, which is fine, because some of my views are liberal. But as, you know, she watches CNN, MSNBC, it's very easy to see the recent scandal going on at the time of me making this video. It's very easy to see, oh my, like what a... And I did the little 30-minute history of world events. I said, you know, Mom, this thing that's happening now with the General Flynn and all, I said, and I helped her understand some of it, because some of the news reporting is General Flynn was the national security advisor for Donald Trump, who just got elected. And General Flynn did indeed have conversations with the Russians before the election took place. And some in the media made it sound like, I'm almost at my old high school up there, some in the media made it sound like this was, some say, I think there's a Doyle Act, which means citizens are not supposed to, on their own, conduct foreign policy. It would have nothing to do with what happened with Flynn. Any president that's coming in has a transition team of possible cabinet appointees and all. And for that transition team, whether it's General Flynn or anybody else, for them to actually have conversations with Russia or anybody as they're coming in. I explained to my mother, I said, all of that's okay. I said, no, because some media reports are like, can you believe they had the secret collusion type thing going on? I said, all of that's okay. Some people forget even the little incident I reminded my mother, and I'm not anti-Obama, but Obama was caught once on an open mic on video, talking to Putin. This was right before his second election, I believe. And he said certain words to the effect, now I understand he was president at the time because it was Obama's first term, but he said words to the effect of, look, after the election's over, we're gonna really take care of stuff, but much what you see in the election, all of that is, a lot of that's politics. Obama said that, caught saying that. Now, the thing with General Flynn, it would be perfectly acceptable for General Flynn to discuss the possibility of future things. It's okay to discuss that. Of course, if there were behind the room, backroom deals and all these, but You're allowed to do that. Then why did Trump fire him or make him resign? It's possible that Flynn lied or even didn't say, yeah, we mentioned sanctions. That it's not as big of a story as the media is making it out to be. And I believe they're probably going to push for maybe to get Trump impeached if they could possibly do that. And I'm not a big Trump supporter. But for 3 days of that, and then I covered world politics, world affairs, things that are going on, things that I've told to my mom. I said, look, these are other important issues. And for day to day, for this to be like, what did he know, when did he know it? I said, it makes no difference what he knew when he knew, because there was nothing to know that was illegal as far as we understand in anything. The only so-called crime would have been, it's not a crime. The only so-called mistake would have been if General Flynn did not tell Vice President Pence or President Trump the truth. Meaning if Flynn brought up sanctions, talked about it, which would have been okay to talk about sanctions. It wasn't illegal, like I just explained, for a transitional advisor to discuss matters. It wasn't illegal to do that. But it's such a big thing now. And so when I explain some of it, not from a conservative view, not from a liberal view, but just explaining to my mom, who watches a lot of this while I'm staying at the old house where I grew up, she said, you know, John, you should write like a 30 or like a letter. I said, I do videos on these issues now. I said, you should write one like that, because I explained some things. And she said, and like send it to Chris Matthews. And I'm missing. I said, I do write on a lot of these issues, and I don't want to waste it. There's my old high school. Okay? So I went to high school. I'll walk back. So that way a lot of my old friends from the area get to see the old town. So I just wanted to mention that only because it's happening right now in the news. And the media in the country, I just don't think they're doing a service. I think they just do a disservice. Both sides. Both sides. To them, this is so important, and there's so much more. You see me right on Mosul. That was just one little thing. The Iraqi city, which there's some serious things. But there was recently, just a week and a half ago, another raid we did in Yemen, which we're in Yemen doing a proxy war. There's a proxy war going on in Yemen. I've covered that before. And so there were some kids, some civilians killed also. Now these actions that our country somewhat is involved in, because we are there doing these things, those are important things. Those are important things. And if we spend days and days and days on things that are not important, things that are simply, let's get the other side, whatever side it is, it's just a disservice, okay? So that'll just be my few comments. I might have another video today, but we covered 2 Samuel 19. Let's see. It's about, 30 minutes. And it's a lot of palace intrigue, okay? And that's really kind of what the media is doing. All the time spent on all this is like palace intrigue. Meaning, oh, look how interesting it is. Look how... It's much ado about nothing. It's much ado about nothing. And my poor mom, by watching a lot, she watched MSNBC, she believed that the possibility that Flynn discussed anything was like a serious crime, like espionage. Not because that's how the media made it look. I said, that's actually common practice for incoming administrations to begin having discussions. That's why they give them security clearances, things of that nature, because they need to know. That's called transition. And unless there was some proof of some high crime, like that was okay to do. If he lied about it, then that was not okay. And it's not a crime. If he lied to Pence or to Trump and said, I never discussed sanctions with any leaders of Russia, that would have just been a lie. It wouldn't have been a crime. Okay? we'll end this one. I want you to see the nice. That was my normal walk. You saw it all the way from my house, both as a kid to my grade school, Horace Mann, as well as to the high school that you just saw, both Bergen High School. And we'll see if this might be the last one for today. I got a lot more we're going to do, all right? I pray God bless all you guys, all my old friends. Enjoy seeing some of the